300 years of data on UK government spending and borrowing. It's absolutely fascinating for an economist. What it shows is that since 1693, governments have always borrowed, and in the 18th and 19th century, it was about borrowing to fund wars. Actually, civil expenditure was vanishingly low through the 18th and 19th century. In the 20th century, of course, there were two very big wars, very expensive wars, which led to huge rises in borrowing. But the other thing that changed was that the state expanded and the welfare state became a main provider of health, education and welfare, and that was expensive. So through these 300 years, government borrowing has gone up and down, and it's gone up during wars, and it's also gone up in the 20th century and this century against a background of recessions. Borrowing also comes down. It took 80 years to do it, but by the early 1990s, government borrowing was back to where it was as a share of GDP on the eve of the First World War. So borrowing comes down. The real question is who pays for it. Now, governments can walk away from their debts, and they do. The British government's got a good record of paying its debts, and that makes sense because if you pay your debts, you're likely to be able to borrow in future, and you're able to borrow at relatively low costs. So if you are the sort of government that pays your debts, the question is who pays for debt reduction? Well, of course, taxpayers can pay more taxes. The state can spend less money. The other mechanism is that bondholders can see the value of their investments, their government bonds, eroded by inflation, and that certainly happened in the 20th century. So I think the good news is that today government borrowing, although it's high by the standards of the last 40 years, it's way below the peaks that we saw in 1945, in 1918, and in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. And the fact is that borrowing does come down. The really interesting question is who pays to bring borrowing down, and that is far more about politics than it is about economics.